All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. In past episodes, people have asked me questions about parenting and parenting books and things related to parenting books. And I have to admit, I'm not a specialist in this area. Childhood development has never been one of my autistic special interests, unfortunately. Sort of wish it was now that I'm a dad. But fortunately for us, for this episode, we have on Marissa. So Marissa has written a book called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. And yeah, I'll just let you introduce what the book is and how you did your research for it.
Sure. Hi, thanks so much for having me. Hello, listeners. Yeah, my name's Marissa Burt. I, along with my co-author, Kelsey Kramer McGinnis, have written this forthcoming book. And Kelsey and I, what we set out to do was kind of trace the history and development of popular Christian parenting ideas, really from the 1970s on in American evangelicalism. We look at some of the underlying theological assumptions. We look at the common ingredients found there. We look at some of the things that are going on in American society and culture that contributed to the way these things kind of crystallized into various formulas. And then we discuss the impact. During our research process, we read over 100 resources and other media, tapes, CDs, parenting talks, and we also surveyed and interviewed a number of people who either were reflecting back on their experience as adult children who were raised in these contexts, or as parents who had parented according to these frameworks, to kind of consider the impact and maybe help families chart a different way forward.
Yeah, so your book title talks about the myth of good Christian parenting, and that sort of begs the question, what is that? How
Yes.
would you define the myth of good Christian parenting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are multiple myths, just like there are multiple generations that we kind of are considering. But I think one of the biggest myths, the kind of overarching one, is that there is this specific formula, this specific path. Often it's, referenced back to train up a child in the way they should go. And when they are old, they will not depart from it. So this kind of mythical idea that if parents could just get parenting right, if they could just do it God's way, then they can ensure specific outcomes. And in that way, this mythology is wrapped up with kind of prosperity gospel promises and that whole ethos that says, if you do it right, you will be blessed with these there's certain things you desire, and it's within your power to achieve that. And a lot of the other myths kind of trickle down from that overarching one. We like the terminology of mythology because I think it really acknowledges some of the aspirations and longings at play here, the really understandable and deeply rooted desires that crop up in family life, and also some of the false messaging that this is either impossible to achieve or it's a betrayal. It just doesn't turn out that way. So we're trying to capture a number of those things. A lot of times people are curious about some of the specific myths. These would include kind of our the way our book is structured. The first part of the book traces the history, looks at some of the key figures, what's going on historically speaking. The second part of the book kind of examines some of the content, which is where you find a lot of the specifics of the mythology. So things like instant obedience, instant cheerful compliance, hierarchies in family life, kind of umbrellas of authority in the family home based on evangelical ideals, ideas about thanking and sin and atonement, as well as kind of parents acting as agents of God's authority. These are kind of some of the big ones that show up again and again and again.
Yeah, so where did these ideas come from? Like, obviously, this idea didn't just like emerge out of a vacuum.
Mhm.
What spawned these myths of good Christian parenting, and how did they become a thing?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm going to answer it in two different ways.
Sure.
One, I think you kind of see common threads of these myths across evangelical subcultures broadly, even outside of family life teaching. And in some ways, these are myths just applied directly to family life teaching, right? Like I mentioned, prosperity gospel promises, like one size fits all, do this and you'll achieve blessing. So in some ways, they're kind of in the water everyone's swimming in. in particularly the 70s and 80s and 90s. You have things like the Nouthetic biblical counseling movement telling everyone the Bible is your instruction manual for life. You have the inerrancy movement really doubling down on that. You have the complementarian movement talking about hierarchies in the home. So these things are going on in the broader culture, as well as politically speaking. You have the pendulum swinging for law and order and kind of respect for authority. And so then in some ways, they're kind of just people taking those ideas that everyone's kind of looking at each other and agreeing on and applying it to parenting, right? A lot of the evangelical parenting manuals were written by people heavily influenced by Jay Adams and the biblical counseling movement. So they're kind of building on that. So that's going on in one sense. In another sense, you just have the extreme profitability of these myths. James Dobson, really, we mark him as the beginning of the era of evangelical parenting empires, because he kind of paves the way of saying, we really need to cultivate a uniquely Christian parenting advice market, and demonstrates how lucrative that can be. Because I think before that, you maybe have Dr. Spock giving some advice. You might have a medical doctor giving advice, or occasionally pastors are maybe talking about parenting. You look back in the literature of the 1800s, the 1900s, it's often coming from the pulpit, and it's not very specific or prescriptive. It's pretty remarkable when you look back and read some of the original things compared to kind of the parenting manuals we get later. But Dobson really in his moment is saying, no, we need to do something different. And as that develops, more and more people begin to say, okay, we need specifically Christian parenting advice. It parallels a mistrust of outside authority, of skepticism of secular authority. And so there's definitely an insider dynamic that says we're looking for not just a method of parenting or some options for parenting, but specifically the quote unquote biblical way to parent. And a bunch of experts have lined up to sell parents resources that tell them what the biblical way to parent is.
Yeah, that's one of the things that always strikes me as odd. I've read a lot of these resources, mostly because the autistic people that I talk to are often raised with parents who read through these resources and stuck to them pretty closely. And so I've read through them, and they claim to be very, like, Bible-centric, coming from the Bible. But one of the things that strikes you is when you think about the Bible is many things, but a detailed resource for raising children, it is not. So,
Yeah,
so
it's not a parenting book.
yeah, how do you get a biblical parenting structure out of the Bible when it
I
has like
wish
10
more,
verses about children?
I wish more people asked this question because yes, exactly this. It's more just vibes based, right? Like there's very little direct parenting instruction in the Bible. In fact, most of it just comes to us as narrative form to begin with. So we're getting stories of people interacting with the world, of God interacting with people. And the only specific Christian parenting advice we have in the entire New Testament is repeated twice. It's fathers, do not embitter or provoke your children. In Ephesians 6, it's followed up, but bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. So it's very limited. You can't really write a book about that. Maybe I'm sure someone out there has written a whole book about that one verse. But in general, when you read these manuals, you find people just offering their interpretations and their advice, their 2 cents, kind of, and dressing it up as this is the word of God. And sometimes they'll directly say that, they'll say, look, I am standing on the authority of God's word. So they'll make these really big claims, and then they'll lead parents into something that's, by any metric, very culturally determined, myopic, very specific to American evangelicalism in the 80s and 90s. And I think those big introductory claims really appeal to devout people's desire to please the Lord, and particularly people who maybe are new converts or who are overwhelmed by the big transition to parenting, the high stakes, right? Most parents can be overwhelmed by how out of control parenting can feel. And so that sounds really good. Like, I'm
You know,
not trying to figure this out for myself, it kind of shuffles some responsibility off on God, frankly, to say, well, that'll be my guide. Then I'll know I'm on sure ground and can do this right. And so once Christian parenting experts have made that claim, kind of anything they say, falls under that umbrella. Now, sometimes you might find a book like Ted Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart has a bunch of parenthetical, so in parentheses, like Bible references, Bible verse references, kind of untethered to his points. Whether parents are looking those up or trying to be like, how does Romans 1 apply to my parenting? You know, that one shows up a lot. Hebrews 12 shows up a lot. The rod verses in Proverbs show up a lot. A lot of times that parenting experts aren't trying to make a hermeneutical case. They really are just proof texting various Bible verses to endorse what they're saying. So a lot of times, though, there's not even an effort at that. One thing I found really surprising when I was reading a lot of these resources is I found myself questioning why pastors and others who did have biblical training weren't challenging these resources. Why were they kind of letting them circulate or recommending them to circulate? Because in some sense, I could see how maybe a layperson or someone who's a new convert could read that and think, oh, well, if this is God's way, I want to do it. But people who maybe have some understanding, some biblical literacy, why they weren't some of the first to see the flaws here and say, whoa, what's going on? Why is this being offered to families? So I found that kind of mysterious.
Yeah, so something just to add there, you talked about this being really appealing to new converts and parents who are overwhelmed by the new transition into parenthood. There's another category of parents who are very interested in this, and those are parents who discovered their child has this new mysterious diagnosis called autism.
Yes.
And there's a lot of interesting parallels that I found in my research of just children who were raised this way, often by autistic parents who themselves were not coping very well,
Yeah.
and thought, okay, where's the instruction manual?
Yep.
What am I supposed to do here? And then having a child and they get diagnosed with a cognitive developmental disorder or a neurodevelopmental disorder, and they think, oh, I must have done something wrong. How do I correct this? How do I do this? And so they pick up these books. And then unfortunately, just to put it mildly, I don't think these people were particularly sensitive to the unique concerns that autistic children
It's an understatement. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And oftentimes they are aware of autism. So James Dobson himself was aware of autism from a pretty early stage. And a lot of these parenting books, though, the ones that I've read and the ones that I've read specifically about autism, basically overinterpret child behavior as being sin or sin nature, and not just like, yeah, your child has an underdeveloped frontal cortex or something like that, because they're two. So they interpret all behavior as some sort of expression of sin and things like that. At least that's what I found. And so you get these dynamics where autistic people either end up being the problem child that isn't very compliant and can't comply very well, or refuses to comply very well. And their advice in these books is usually to beat them, basically, to beat them into submission and to break their spirit. And James Dobson, I think, was it James Dobson that wrote The Strong-Willed Child? Which is basically about how to break the spirit of your autistic child. I mean, that's not what it's actually about, but that's essentially what it's about.
What it adds up to.
Yeah. And so can you talk about like where that comes from in the literature?
Yeah, you've made some really astute observations there. It sparks a couple of thoughts for me. One is absolutely, there's an absolute lack of any meaningful consideration of neurodivergence, autism, disability, anything outside of a child who's going to comply easily is really not discussed. That is the expectation, especially in resources that kind of tout first time obedience. The expectation is that children ought to comply immediately and without question, and that parents can expect that. And when this is paired with the idea that parents act as agents of God, really anything a parent doesn't like can be perceived as disobedience. And anything a parent wants can become a matter of obedience. So I don't know how many parents, I'm sure there were some just malformed, abusive parents who were kind of setting out to harm children. I think there probably were a number of parents who weren't necessarily doing that math in their head, but were saying, look, God wants me to solicit unquestioning obedience. And often they were told this had eternal stakes. Like if parents don't teach their children to obey without question, their parents' souls might be in peril. Their children's souls might be in peril because they won't learn to obey God. So when you have these kind of eternal stakes, a lot of times parents will escalate. Like it can never just be, oh, the toddler threw their food off the high chair, right? Like it escalates this to this is defiance, this is rebellion against God, this is sin. And that has a way of making every interaction very high stakes and antagonistic between parent and child. It's more than just a power struggle. This is a little bit of good and evil kind of stakes, which can have some incidental downstream effects, the dehumanization of children, the breaking of any sense of parental trust and safety. Unfortunately, through these methods, that those are kind of like collateral things that happen while the parent is busy thinking, I am training up my child in the way they should go. So that's kind of at play. And then also the direct catechesis in these books are, it's your job as a parent to diagnose the sin in your child's heart. That's Ted Tripp, Shepherding a Child's Heart, one of the most best-selling, continues to be highly recommended book. That's the thesis of it. This really is, it's not just behaviorism. I think he was reacting maybe to Dobson's more behavioristic methods and saying it's not just that. No, it's a spiritual project for parents. So you do need to diagnose the sin. You do need to deal with the sin. You need to punish and maybe even figure out how to atone for the sin. It gets very muddy, theologically speaking, in these resources because they're not crisply parsing things out. There's a lot of Christianese word salad going on. But it's interesting to see kind of the development of that because you have Dobson kind of starting the market. And interestingly, his very first book is not really even recognizably a Christian resource. Like if you read Dare to Discipline, it doesn't really read as a particularly Christian resource. There's a chapter, there's like 2 pages in the end written as a note to moms that has some Bible verses. But the rest of it is pretty just this common sense, omnicompetent, authoritarian, I'm going to tell you how to parent. And he leans into his credentials as a psychologist. He does note autism and kind of I think probably adjusting for maybe what was going on in the year 1970 in psychotherapy. Maybe he's describing standard practice. It's kind of this horrific anecdote of autistic children being isolated in a dark room and kind of like food thrown in at them. I mean, it's very dehumanizing.
It's
And
it's the early stages of what is now called ABA or
okay,
applied behavioral adjustment.
yeah,
But so basically what happens for those who are wondering, the anecdote in this book is
yeah,
this child is basically put, so autistic children famously very bad at eye contact, not super into that. And they're like, well, this is clearly a defect. Your child needs to be making eye contact.
yeah.
And so we are basically going to like Skinner box train these children
Mhm. Yeah,
where
that's the
where
term.
we
Yep.
where we put them in a dark environment and
Mhm.
then sensorily deprive them
Yeah.
and then open a small slit
Mhm.
with only your eyes, and then as soon as the child makes eye contact, you leave it open for them, but as soon as they break it, you shut it and leave them sensorily blinded again until they keep looking at your eyes because they start to like associate eye contact with this sort of positive reinforcement or the
Goodness.
lack of negative consequences, and things like that. And so a lot of what is now ABA, and things like that are based on these sort of
Oh, gee.
ideas and techniques. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, modern ABA has changed quite a bit, but that is basically where it came from.
The word
It's
symbol.
very, yeah, it's very funny because that's like literally a torture technique.
Right? I mean, when I read that, I was like, what is, you know, it's, you read it and it's so just troubling and disturbing. And so, yeah, I think Dobson's resources really end up standing out because, frankly, most of the other popular resources are not even attempting to consider the social sciences or psychological resource. Most of the other Christian parenting resources would reject that across the board, whatever is going on there. And there's not meaningful discussion of either child development or anything. I mean, once in a while you might get a chapter on kind of like a lump together categories that might be termed like special needs that might include different things, but that could also include things like adoption in family. So it's kind of the, sometimes there'll be a chapter at the end of like, oh, if your family doesn't look like what we're presenting as normal, this two-parent, intact, pretty much middle class, white, suburban family with 2.5 children, then you fall outside this category and you might get a little aside. But the assumption is it's one size fits all. Most of the people writing these books in the 70s and 80s are white men. You start to see white women more in the 90s and 2000s. So it's a very small lens. A lot of that's due to Christian publishing being dominated by white pastors or evangelical publishing. So that really plays into what shows up and what doesn't show up in the resources. But I'm kind of trying to circle back to the sin topic because I really do think that is a significant piece in that it leaves parents asking in almost every situation, who sinned, this man or his parents, right? Like this is the question at hand because it can't simply be a child has a skills gap or miscommunication is happening or somebody's tired or somebody's hungry or somebody's human. It has to be this thin issue, which really does lead to an intensity of parental response. And when it's paired with corporal punishment, as it almost universally is, it almost guarantees escalation because unless a child is compliant, and maybe a child in that sense would be compliant with or without spanking, they maybe just are compliant. But unless a child is compliant, that is the primary tool parents are given. And it's up to them how to wield it, right? Like if again, like I mentioned, they kind of have this godlike presence. So if it's something they don't like, if they don't like the tone of voice a child responded, if they don't like an expression on a child's face, like all of this can be perceived as rebellion and disobedience that requires these kind of liturgies of spanking. And of course, it's always behind closed doors. Often parents are directly told to avoid CPS. And in this kind of very coded language, as as we get closer to the present day, in this kind of coded language, parents and experts are dancing around the fact that broader society has moved away from spanking. So you maybe need to just really keep this in the privacy of your own home. And it's really such a betrayal. I think the Christian community collectively, we have failed hundreds of thousands of children and families. Yes, this betrayed entire families, but the children are the ones who were on the receiving end of the brunt of this. And it's something worthy of noting, of talking about, of listening to the many people who as adults are maybe recounting some of their experiences and saying them, and of working to change, to say we need to stop enabling this as a Christian community. We need to call out these resources, throw them in the trash, and we need to start saying things like, no, spanking is not an option for Christian parents. Like, no, the diagnosis of sin is not the task of Christian parents, to really directly oppose some of this advice that's been circulating for a long time.
So one of the things, like you sort of talked about, that I noticed a lot is, like you said, this expectation of normal, and then basically having absolutely nothing to say when people aren't normal.
Yeah,
And
you're on your
and
own. Yep.
yeah, and the sort of idea is if you fall outside of normal, your entire goal is to bring your child back in line, right? And to bring them back by basically any means necessary, and any failure to bring them back in line is essentially a complete and total parenting failure, and you will lose your legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very like, this is the silver bullet, this is the solution, I will not entertain anything other than this
Yeah.
one specific solution. And it just reminds me of a lot of like other like toxic online
Mm-hmm.
communities.
Mm-hmm.
So one that I frequently mention on the podcast are incels, who basically have this like really narrow ideology of, this is what women are like, this is what they do, and this is the way that you communicate with them. And if they don't, it's because like something in you is fundamentally broken, or something in the woman is
Yep.
fundamentally broken, and there is no room for nuance. There is
Mm-hmm.
no room for nuanced thinking. There is no room for conditionals. It's all just like, look, according to this definition, this is how men behave and this is how women
Mm-hmm.
behave. And if we just do the math and find all the right cheat codes, basically,
Mm-hmm.
everything should work. And basically your life is one basic problem of just finding the exact right inputs. And if you find those exact right inputs, everything else will work perfectly fine. And I mean, like, purity culture is a really good example of this,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, it's basically like you talked about it being, this is the prosperity gospel for
Mm-hmm.
children, and like purity culture is a prosperity culture
Yep.
for sex, basically.
Yep.
And it's sort of just like this absurd trend that keeps on recapitulating itself throughout especially throughout the communities that I research, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
autistic communities, because it's extremely black and white in its thinking, and that's like a known diagnostic criteria of
Mm-hmm.
autism spectrum disorders, is this harsh black and white thinking of either or, and this
Mm-hmm.
really absolutist moral reasoning. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of autistic parents, we talk about the children and say that autistic children were victims of this. They absolutely were, but oftentimes perpetuated by their autistic parent. So a lot of the autistic people that I've talked to who were raised under these conditions and raised in these places, uh, were raised by an autistic parent who
Mm-hmm.
read those books and was like,
Yeah.
this is the absolute instruction manual,
Yeah.
and this is the only way to parent, and I'm going to do everything to the letter, and also get really frustrated when things don't work.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna lose my mind. And so it's this like, I describe it as like intergenerational self-harm, where you're sort of
Mm-hmm.
just like, you, the autistic person, are perpetuating a harmful cycle against your other autistic children. And it's this really weird cycle where autism is both the thing exacerbating it and making
Yep.
it worse, and also the thing that is preventing the one size fits all solution from actually working. Not that it works well on non-autistic
Right.
children, really, but
Yeah.
yeah, I've noticed a lot of those dynamics in the autistic people that I've talked to who were raised
Yeah.
with this, and it's quite a few. Like most autistic people in my generation, like 30 plus, were raised with some form of this, whether it was like to the extreme or not. I wasn't. Like, I was raised by conservative evangelical parents, but they were not like this at all.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that had more to do with the fact that both my parents are very highly educated, and my mother's
Mm-hmm.
a scientist and was very science based
Yeah.
in her thinking of child raising. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's it's interesting, a couple of things you said, because yeah, that all tracks. And I think the appeal of the black and white thinking, I mean, most of these promises are very black and white, has the effect of reinforcing it for families who perceive that it quote unquote works, or maybe if it quote unquote works in the very early years when children can be coerced to comply in different ways. So they kind of can go a ways thinking that this is working out well. And also, yes, if it doesn't work for you, the problem is going to be either you, user error, like you did it wrong, or your child's. Like there's something
Yeah.
uniquely flawed about your child. So there's a lot of shame, I think, that comes for families who discover whether they discover it during the active parenting years or down the road when they're realizing the long-term consequences of this in their relational dynamics of what happened, because my intentions were X and this result is Z, and the methodology itself leaves people really ill-equipped to untangle that. I've also heard from some people who, more so in recent years, I don't know if this was the case during like the era of Dobson or Gary Ezzo, but who maybe having a child who was diagnosed or discovering a child that it didn't work for was a gateway for them out of this kind of rigid parenting philosophy, one size fits all. It didn't work. So they were kind of compelled to seek out alternative options, and as a result they maybe were introduced to new ideas or learned about child development. So I hear from a lot of parents of neurodivergent children, or parents who went through something like foster to adoption programs, and in the training for those programs learned new paradigms. And we're like, oh, well, maybe behavior is communication, or oh, well, maybe child development does matter. And those kind of became gateways out. But yeah, I think a lot of people end up stuck in it and replicating it, and just, yeah, trying harder to make it work, escalating. And the resources will often encourage that, right? They'll say, you need to reset everything. You need to sit your children down and apologize that you haven't been consistent with spanking and tell them you're going to be. Or you need to institute, I think Doug Wilson calls it a quote unquote reign of terror, where there's going to be no warnings. It's just instant first time obedience or else punishment. So these kind of like nightmarish scenarios that I think really a lot of children just maybe survived, but it comes with long lasting impacts that shaped the way they viewed the world, shaped the way they viewed relationships, and certainly when it came with spiritual catechesis, the way they viewed God. So there's a lot of things for people to kind of consider and untangle and think through as they're maybe reaching adulthood and different milestones that cause them to rethink their family of origin, whether that's becoming a parent themselves or even just moving away from home, going to a new community, a new employment scenario, something that might spark those kind of questions.
Yeah, so I've noticed that particularly that sort of trend of rethinking things and sort of breaking the cycle happened a lot more after like 2005-ish, because
Mm.
that's when autism, like Asperger's, started to become well known.
Mm.
Like more people started to know what Asperger's was,
Mhm.
and more people started to get diagnosed with it. And I found that like a lot of parents, when their child gets diagnosed with Asperger's, there's a strong genetic component to autism,
Mhm.
where if your child has it, there's a fairly decent chance you or
Mm.
someone else in your
In your
family might.
family.
And so like throughout the chains, you sort of look back, and a lot of parents who had children growing up in the 2000 and especially 2010s, they didn't know they were autistic
Yeah.
until their child got diagnosed with
Hmm.
autism. And they
Hmm.
go to the assessment and they're like adamant, my
Oh.
child does not have autism. Like that is just a normal thing that every child does. I did that when I was a child. And the assessor goes, oh,
Well,
do I have to break this to you softly?
yeah,
Or yeah, so,
yeah.
so that's like incredibly common. And I
Well,
often found that
yeah.
like a catalyst to allowing them to rethink things and allowing them to reinteract with this, because I found there were sort of two paradigms that a lot of autistic people had when they were raised under these conditions. One of them is the sort of black sheep,
Mhm,
where they didn't comply from an early age and
mhm,
basically never complied
mhm,
and weren't very good at
mhm.
meeting expectations. And basically deconverted the second they left home. Basically, as soon as they're out the door, Christianity gone out the
Right.
window, never looking back. This is
Yeah.
the worst. And like clear and direct association with the abuse that they suffered in childhood with Christianity and being
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, Christianity, oh, this is the abuse religion. And especially being autistic, like seeing things pretty black and white, seeing things pretty
Mm-hmm.
clearly, it's like, yep, that's what this is. Like, this is what effect it has because look at the evidence. And then the second type were hyper compliant children. So
Mm-hmm.
autistic, this is especially common in autistic girls who would
Mm-hmm.
be like extremely hyper compliant and so hyper compliant that they're like, do I even have an identity outside of this like compliant hierarchy?
Yeah.
And having to radically rethink their relationship to Christianity later on. And basically what I found is that these parenting resources basically promise you a legacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you raise your children this way, they will grow up to be good, godly, God-fearing parents who will participate in all these grand political projects to take back
Mm-hmm.
America in
Yep.
some cases, and things like that. And most assuredly, they will be good Christians who will have many grandchildren, and they will
Mm-hmm.
raise them up right. And what pretty much happened across the board with the population that I study, which is autistic Christians and ex-Christians, is basically the exact opposite of that happened. There was like rapid deconversion and rapid leaving of the faith, and then basically associating Christianity and everything related to Christianity with this like extreme toxicity that
Mm-hmm.
you need to get away from and that you
Yeah.
need to do everything in your power to separate yourself from. And almost all the autistic people who were raised under these conditions are now looking back at their childhood and being like, that was not great. And it could have been a lot different. And in many cases, like the irony is they're trying to parent in a way that ensures their children will be Christian in the one way that is guaranteed to make them not that way.
Yeah.
Right. And then also like I found a lot of these things, parenting is really closely tied to theology, and so you
Mm-hmm.
find all sorts of weird stuff like uh eternal functional subordination of the son being tied to like parenting
Yeah.
techniques,
Yep.
especially in like the Wilsonite things. And it's just a sort of wild ride of really bad theology gets introduced, and like social trinitarianism gets introduced
It's
in order
yeah.
to justify like these rigid strict hierarchies that you need to have at all times in all places, and you need to establish these sort of dominance hierarchies and patterns of submission and authority. And so if these patterns exist in families, they should exist everywhere,
Yeah.
right? They should exist in the godhead, they should exist
Yeah.
in government, they should. And basically this whole thing is learning how to build and be under one hierarchy.
Yeah. And it absolutely, it's this self-reinforcing thing because by tethering everything to the quote unquote biblical way, by saying like, oh, that's what we want to follow, then there are all these maneuverings to really make it biblical, right? Like everything has to have a biblical root. And so, yeah, you get a lot of, we call them stowaway theological doctrines because a lot of times people are picking up a parenting resource that someone handed them because they're, like you said, frustrated, overwhelmed. They don't know what to do. They're maybe not aware that they're being introduced to Doug Wilson, Federal Vision, or something. They may not be aware that they're signing up for doctrines of penal substitutionary atonement, but these things are woven throughout the parenting ideas, the way the authors are saying, well, this is why it's godly to think your child in this way or whatever. It's usually coming with some of these theological presuppositions and often really rudimentary or incompletely explained, even in terms of what they're trying to represent. And the overall effect is, I think people get sometimes sucked further and further down these pipelines. I do think it's how someone starts out just wondering how they can get their toddler to stop melting down in the grocery store and ends up wanting to move to Moscow, Idaho, because they have to find the right way to do this. And these resources circulated a lot at conferences aimed at families. A lot of insular communities built their ministries around family life teaching, right? Like Bill Gothard's a great example of that. A lot of people are handing them around in homeschooling conferences and word of mouth. There's, particularly before the internet era, there's a huge grassroots nature to how these resources circulate. Certainly, everybody kind of knew Dobson, right? He's on the radio. At sometimes he's referred to as America's family psychologist. So he's reaching some secular audiences, but more and more as the kind of market demand grew, you have different niche people peeling off and kind of creating ministry empires that often went global, were exported via missionaries and other things, or now through streaming services. So yeah, it definitely catechized people into a certain kind of Christianity. And it also catechized parents into those expectations. You're absolutely right. There were promises made of legacy, whether that was children in the hands of a warrior, children are arrows to fight the culture war, or whether it was just you can anticipate that you'll have everybody around the holiday table with you and you'll all go to church together. You know, these kind of aspirational ideas that appeal to people's longings. Unfortunately, what we found as we talked to people and surveyed people is that almost certainly somewhere down the road, adult children, because this is part of human development, do differentiate, they individuate, they do go through a stage of development where they are thinking through for themselves. They're rejecting things that maybe they want to not take from their families of origin, things they do want to take. And these frameworks leave parents uniquely ill-equipped to tolerate any kind of difference, let alone normal human development that would maybe take an adult child on a totally different path because of all the things we talked about, the sin, the instant obedience, the compliance. Like a parent has trained themselves to expect that from all the years they've been parenting that way day in and day out. So when adult children leave home and yes, are immediately like, I reject the faith, or, you know, decide to vote differently or decide to attend a different denomination of church or any number of things, the parents are really ill-equipped to tolerate that because to them, it looks like the disobedience that is not permissible. And so often they will pull coercive levers because that was the tool they were given. Spanking is how you secure compliance. So they will pull other punitive measures. Often estrangement is one that they might pull, or a lot of pressure. Maybe they send unwanted spiritual materials to their adult children, kind of put the guilt on, like all your mom wants for Christmas is you to go to church, or, you know, things like this that really try and pressure adult children into faith decisions because they believe that's in their control and that's part of what they were promised. And sometimes they maybe even feel like a missional compulsion of my child's eternal well-being is at stake. So again, these really high stakes then have parents operating that way. So I think the fruit of it is not good. You kind of can see that it's difficult to try and quantify this, right? Like individual families have unique factors that are going to mitigate or exacerbate this stuff in different ways. But you can definitely just trace these patterns and see where it goes. And at a certain point, you hear enough accounts with similar themes that you say, it does make sense. This is what these ingredients add up to. They add up to families that don't know how to tolerate difference, that don't know how to see a child's individuality, of everybody operating under this heavy pressure to comply and perform in a certain way. There's a lot of pressure in these resources on parents to have obedient children as well. like they will be judged by their communities and by society at large. There's often eternal stakes. Like if parents don't get this right, the fate of the world or the nation is at stake, you know? So it is just a heavy yoke for everybody. And really, I think the only people it kind of works for are the people who either adult children have chosen to stay closely aligned with whatever their parents believe, or there's just everyone kind of accustomed to inauthentic connection and relationship that doesn't rock the boat.
Yeah, and one really big thing that I found with talking to the people that I research is a lot of them have a very tense and difficult relationship with their parents because of these things, and often basically live a double life where
Yeah.
they pretend that they're living one way, but they're not at
Mhm.
all living that way, and they're
Yeah.
just like, it's not worth telling my parents, it's
Yeah.
not worth having a conversation with them. And at this point I don't really care anymore about what they think or what they say, and so I'm just going to do whatever I'm going to do, and I'm going to let them entertain whatever fantasy about my life they would like
Right.
to entertain. And that usually works pretty well until you start having kids.
Yep.
And then at that point it's like, okay, well, we can no longer maintain this illusion of a double life. And that often leads to a lot of the people I study, once they have kids, having to set some pretty strict boundaries with their parents. And
Yeah.
because their parents want to basically raise their grandchildren the same
The
way
same
that
way.
they raise their children, and their children very much don't want to.
Yeah.
And so that often leads to them being like, actually, no, you will not spank our children. And if you try
Right.
that, you're gone and you won't be able to see the
Yeah.
children again. And like these things are apparently like cause massive estrangement and massive
Mhm.
difficulties
Yep.
with their adult children. And the parents don't understand why. And the parents are like, well, we did everything right. Like
Right.
we did everything correctly, and now my granddaughter has they them pronouns. What went on with and I mean, especially within the autistic community, that happens a lot.
Right.
Yeah, so a lot of times, um, they have to have these conversations with their parents to be like, look, we are simply not doing it the way that you did, and we don't really care about maintaining those things. And so you think you have control, but you don't. And so we're setting the terms, and this is how it's going to go from now on. And that often leads to just very low levels of grandparental involvement. And yeah, and again, a lot of times the parents that are most into it are also autistic and have a
Mhm.
really big difficulty understanding this because they have very absolutist black and white thinking
Yeah.
ways of processing these things. And yeah, that just leads to a lot of very difficult situations to deal with.
Yeah.
So
With people who don't necessarily have, at least familially, have not really practiced
yeah,
communication, conflict
yeah,
resolution. Often, like people are really uniquely ill equipped, and in communities that don't, church communities that haven't really equipped them for that either. So, yeah, I think that's probably more common than is talked about because of the stigma and shame around it in Christian communities. Things like estrangement and low contact or no contact, and some of that too is, I think, people kind of stumbling through how do we create something new? Because a lot of people, I think, do reach that point in adulthood. Like you said, they have children or whatever other marker instigates that. But because there isn't a skill set, it's kind of like how when people leave fundamentalism and find a new fundamentalism, right? They're looking for new absolute terms, it's just different clothing. I think
yeah,
similarly, kind of leave this system and are like, oh, well, the way I have to do this now has to look like no contact or low contact. It can be messy to try and figure out boundaries when boundaries have never been possible before, right? It can take a while. So I do think it's helpful that some people have been able to connect online and in virtual communities, because I think before this, a lot of people just like moved across the country from their parents. Or something
yep,
like this is what happened. And I did a reel the other week, and it was interesting hearing a lot of people sharing their stories on Instagram because they were saying, yes, this happened elsewhere in my family line. I can see it. It just was called leaving home and never coming back and being
Yeah.
geographically removed and writing letters. And that was the way people overcame that hurdle. So, yeah.
Yeah, it is extremely common for autistic people the adults that I interview who are raised in these
Yeah.
families to either be extremely low contact, no contact, or live a complete double life and just fake it for their families to keep up appearances. But yeah, so this is we've been talking about all these sort of like bad things and bad advice in Christian literature.
Yes.
Is there any good advice out there? Like, are there any good books that you would recommend?
That's a
That
good question.
I mean,
I know
you've got like 100.
right, often people will be like, oh, okay, thank you. This is helpful. But yes, I am a parent. So what do you recommend? And neither Kelsey and I have any desire to position ourselves as parenting experts. We do a lot of throat clearing around that. We're kind of like, look, that's not, we're staying in our lane here. We are analyzing these resources. However, that's a really understandable desire, and so we do suggest a couple of things. Well, first to say for many of these resources, even the ones that have a bunch of problems in them, it's not to say that there's nothing of merit in any of these resources. Like some of them probably had some things that helped families, or maybe families were able to apply them in ways that they found helpful and weren't incredibly destructive. Like I think there can be gray here. It doesn't have to be black and white, with a few exceptions. There are some that are just horrible. We recorded a podcast episode this week discussing Michael Pearl's To Train Up Your Child, right? There's nothing of merit in a resource like that. It's basically an abuse manual. So there are some of those where it's like, yeah, no. There are others where maybe it made sense, or I do think historical context is important. Like some of these resources, for instance, James Dobson's ministry, which was hugely problematic, I think in a number of ways, was in some ways, I think, trying to course correct for things that came before. There was an interesting article this year or last year by John Fee in The Atlantic. He's a Christian thinker who was talking about how he really credits Dobson with helping his father become less abusive and rage-filled, because his father's legacy was one of coming from a home with, I think, alcoholism and kind of just complete out of control parenting. So this idea that fathers should be present and should maybe rein that in some way was an improvement. So I think it's important to try and have this conversation as we're critiquing and finding legitimate problems with these resources without returning to that same either or thinking that says, well, they are all villains, they are all bad. I do think it was more complicated than that. There's many things going on in a bunch of these resources. That being said, I don't personally recommend any of them. And I'm a pastor's wife, and so often with people in my own community, the one Christian parenting resource I still will encourage people to check out is called Connected Families. I like it because they have a whole team of people with different areas of expertise. They talk about brain science, they talk about child development, they talk about neurodivergent. They have a lot of different voices trying to empower parents to see and tend the specific children entrusted to their care, and also to prioritize connection over behavior. So kind of have a framework that really is prioritizing that. Similarly, there's a new book called The Flourishing Family by David and Amanda Erickson. It's a Christian resource. They have, I think, one, maybe two autistic children. So they actually have spent a great deal of time trying to learn how might these considerations play into Christian parenting practices. So that is a good resource. I will often point parents, particularly of small children, to. And then another book called Household by Dr. Emily Hunter McGowan. I think it's called Household of Faith. I'm looking really quick. I really like this one. It's not a parenting guide, but it's a theology of the family. Yeah, it's called Households of Faith, Practicing Family in the Kingdom of God. I recommend this because it invites parents to a different paradigm to say, what is the purpose of family? What do we learn about being children of God in the kind of family life terms that the New Testament authors choose, that we're in church families? So I like that one as an alternative theological paradigm. But those are kind of the ones I'm willing to sort of say with a lot of disclaimers. The disclaimers being, I think every family has unique considerations, unique cultures, unique temperaments of children. So even a resource like Connected Families that maybe I personally have found helpful as a parent might not resonate with someone else. And I think we need to do a lot of disclaimers like that to course correct for the authority that so much Christian parenting content has been passed around with, to sort of say, here's some ideas. These are just some people's opinions. You might try it with your family, but to really return agency to Christian families to say, look, there's so much freedom for the Christian parent to determine what might be helpful in the work, the vocation of parenting they've been given to do. And we can really embrace that freedom in light of general Christian principles: love for God, love for neighbor, including our smallest and newest ones, the one anothering verses in the New Testament, how to treat people kindly, treat people the way we want to be treated, these sort of general principles that rarely show up in Christian parenting manuals that I think are applicable. I don't know if that gets at your question.
Yeah, no, that does. Another sort of companion question to that is there anything to look out for as a sort of red flag, yellow flag, green flag in Christian parenting or Christian resources?
Yes. And this is, yes, this is something by the time this episode's out, we probably will have a downloadable resource available. It's an appendix in our book. We created kind of a green light, yellow light, red light metric with the hopes that parents could use that to kind of run a resource through to say, do I want to listen more to this person and what they have to say? So I think a couple general categories to consider are the credentials of the parenting expert. Like, why are you listening to them? Why do they have a platform? What is their area of expertise? Do you know them personally? How did you hear about them? Because obviously the new Christian parenting experts these days are parenting influencers, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors there. Just because someone has a big platform doesn't mean their advice is good advice. So first, kind of asking some of those questions, and that can maybe help a parent say, well, do I trust this person? What's their range of experience? Something else we didn't necessarily talk about, but holds true. A lot of these Christian parenting resources were written by parents when their children were very young, like preschool, toddler age. That's not to say parents of preschool or toddlers have nothing valuable to say. It's just they have no long-term sense of how is this going to work out. Dobson's writing when he is a preschooler at home, like with the kind of authority that suggests he is the grandfather of many, or something. So author credentials are important. I think language is really important. What's the anthropology of children? How are children being spoken about in this resource? Is it respectful? Is there a mutual nature to the relationship? How are parents spoken about? What's the anthropology of parenthood? What's the kind of spiritual language? Certainly for me, red flags are antagonistic relationship between parent and child, or dehumanizing language, joking about spanking and punishment. Corporal punishment, I think, is a flag. So are expectations for instant obedience. So some of these central myths, I think, should give a parent pause. Like, is this really a path I want to get on if an expert's encouraging me in these directions? Green flags would be, do they consider the unique temperament and challenges of each person in the family? Is there a meaningful discussion of child development, of neurodivergence, of diversity? Is there multiple kind of paths open to a parent here? How does it land with a parent? Like, do they feel like a heavy weight when they're reading this? Do they feel discouraged and they like they need to get to work and try harder, or do they feel empowered? So a number of different things. Maybe by the time this is out, I will try and send along a link that you can include into the show notes to the metric we've developed. But Yeah, I think it's a great question, and really would like to empower parents to think critically about the kind of things that they are consuming that are so often pitched as the only way, God's way, the biblical way, when it's really just somebody's opinion.
Yeah. For autism specifically, if you're reading any autism parenting manuals, a really good question to ask, like a
Mm,
red flag, yellow flag, is
yeah, and I'm
what
curious.
do they think autism is?
Mhm.
So is autism a tragedy? Is
Yes.
autism a problem to be solved? Is autism a enemy that needs to be fought?
Mhm.
If it's one of those, it's probably going to be a garbage resource that you
Yeah,
should
just
not
avoid it.
bother with. So anything that you're looking at that says autism is a demon that has stolen your child,
Mhm.
probably
Oh
don't
my
want to look at.
goodness. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I'm
well,
curious to hear from you because this is something, Kelsey and I just, so many of the resources just don't even talk about anything in the realm of autism or neurodivergent. But I was curious to hear because I was messaging with an autistic person today who was talking about their childhood experience and the way that their parents viewed autism as sin. And I was kind of curious to know if there were resources that maybe were directly saying that. We're sort of saying, like, we're acknowledging the diagnosis and saying it was sin, or if there was just this general sense that the behavioral markers of autism were always chalked up to sin. What is your sense on that? Were there Christian people
it is
out there,
both.
not even necessarily parenting, saying, oh, this diagnosis is legitimate, but it's just a marker of something like sin or demon possession or something like this? I mean, I don't even know if that was that
Yeah,
a thing?
so it's both.
Okay.
It's both of those, depending on which resource you read.
Okay.
A lot of them will describe it as a neurodevelopmental condition that
Hmm.
is a sort of curse from God that is given
Wow.
to you. Some of them will describe it as a a sin issue, like, or especially in more charismatic circles, it will often be described in terms of like possession. And there's this sort of famous YouTube video. Well, I mean, famous in my mind, because I joke about it so much, about a guy from Bethel Church,
Hmm.
like the mega church in
Yeah,
Bethel
yeah.
Reading, speaking about how he faith healed a girl with autism, and he prayed that her autism would go away, and then she stank like fish, like rotten fish for 2 days, and then the autism was gone. And that sort of interpretation behind that is that that was the autism oozing out of her body. That
How bizarre.
anyway, yeah. So the world of Christian parenting books about autism are just like bizarre, uh, in many ways. So the
Were these
the
like kind of self-published, kind of niche? Because I'm curious,
some of them
was
are.
there ever a of this sort of thing, like as
Not that I'm
awareness
aware
grew,
of.
or no?
So most of these are by faith publishing houses that are run
Okay,
by those denominations
interesting.
often, or they're self-published, or they are, published through autism organizations that are like specifically run by the parents of children with ASD3, or what we
Ah,
normally call profound autism, where, they, to be very cleir, these children have enormous challenges, and
yeah.
it's very difficult, and they have a lot of very difficult behaviors. I am not like bashing these parents for not having a good time or anything. Spiritualizing a cognitive developmental disorder and
Doesn't
and
really help
attributing it
anything.
to something that it's not is also not helping at all. Yeah, so there are things
Well,
like
it sounds
that.
like a whole book could be written about that in
Oh yeah.
particular,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I mean, even in like serious theologians, you get a lot of discussion about what autism is, and the use of autism as a sort of metaphor for separation from God, things like that. So I don't know if you're familiar with like Eleanor Stump. She's a
Mm,
famous ethicist, Catholic
okay.
ethicist. She talks a lot about that type of thing. Andrew Pinsent is another Catholic theologian who
Mm,
does work with Aquinas, and he coined the term spiritual autism to
mm,
describe a state of verbotenness and separation from God, being unable to be moved by the Holy Spirit working within you. And this is sort of like pretty pervasive throughout Christian theology,
Mm.
and only in like the last 7 or 8 years have people been seriously challenging this.
Mhm.
Uh, and so
Wow.
these attitudes are very pervasive
Yeah.
throughout the these types of books, and they're often mentioned, like autism is often mentioned in theological reflections on the problem of suffering and the
Mm.
problem of evil and things like that,
Yeah.
as one of these sort of afflictions that God has wrought upon humanity. And so like I would basically say anything that doesn't look at autism as a neurodevelopmental disorder,
Mm.
just if or a neurodevelopmental disability, if it doesn't define autism in those terms and tries to spiritualize it or
Or
separate it,
deny it, probably. Either
yeah,
either one, either extreme, yeah.
yeah, or just basically separate it from its clinical context and sort of data backed scientific resources with good clinical studies in it, I would say run. Don't bother reading those. They're not
Uh-huh.
worth the paper they were written on.
Yeah, take them out of
Um,
circulation. That's what I'm saying.
yes.
Grab it and toss it. What do you have a sense? You said in the past 7 or 8 years, maybe that dialogue is changing. Do you have a sense? I mean, at least from the parish ministry context I'm in, it does seem the conversation around even just broadly speaking disability, which seems to have some overlaps here of like, do we look for healing, for instance, of physical disability or something like that? So a different conversation, but maybe a parallel one is changing where there's like disability theologians who are kind of talking about like challenging Christian communities to think differently about this sort of very simplistic idea of like there's something flawed here that needs fixing, and to say, well, maybe that's an erroneous starting place. Do you sense that changing in the discussion surrounding autism as well in a similar way or different, or what are your thoughts on that?
So I guess it depends on what you mean by changing. Changing in a substantial sense? No, not really. Most people in Christian communities have no idea what autism is and have very poor conceptions of what it is, unless they are in a family with someone who has autism. And then their perception of autism is
Mhm.
basically what that family member has. And so that is not always the best way to learn about autism because it's a very broad heterogeneous condition.
Mm.
In academic theology, it has gotten a lot better, but academic theology doesn't always translate into real life and like real church behavior, right?
Yeah, it may take some
You
time to trickle
you
down.
might, yeah, or like your pastor might encounter it in seminary and not really know what to do with it, and so just doesn't really engage with it. Unfortunately, a lot of the sort of disability theology is also very tied with like specific strains of progressive theology as well. And so if you are in a more conservative seminary, chances are you're not going to encounter that. Chances are it's going to be sort of dismissed with like
Mhm.
all the other X theologies, where X is whatever identity group you get. So a lot of conservative Christians aren't really reading disability theology because disability theology is in and of itself very progressive coded
Hmm.
and
Interesting.
very tied in with those things. That isn't to say all of it is, but just in general, the genre is very much that way, and carries with it a lot of assumptions about like the need to deconstruct orthodoxy and things like
Mhm.
that. I mean, a lot of autistic Christians aren't even interested in doing that, which
Mhm.
is also really funny. There's also a disconnect between what the average autistic Christian is like and what the average like autism theology is like. They don't always align on,
What do
on
you, I'm
things.
curious, what do you mean by that? Or like, what's an example of that?
Okay, so a good example of this is there's a book called Peculiar Discipleship, an Autistic Liberation Theology by Claire Williams. We did a podcast episode on it if anyone wants to listen to me and another fellow autistic man talk about our frustrations with this book. But the book talks about autism from a very specific lens, and it's like it's a lens that I don't think is helpful for approaching a lot of autism. One example, like one really stark example that comes up where it's like, I think you might be really out of pace with the average autistic person, is a discussion about um accommodation and liberation. Are you familiar with the difference between those? Yeah, so she basically says accommodation has failed. We like mere accommodation does not work. We need liberation for autistic people. If you pull the average autistic person, which I have, we don't want liberation. Like liberation from what? And from who? Who are my No, I like my church. I just want my church to be a little more understanding of me. Like I don't want to wildly change the context. I don't want to tear it down. I don't want to be liberated from my church. I want my church to understand that I sometimes have sensory processing difficulties and find it hard to socialize. And so I would like a little bit of help. And I would just like accommodation. However, like the book flat out rejects the idea of accommodation
I see.
per se. And there's this sort of like faux radicalism in a lot of the writings that you often find, where in some theology spaces you are encouraged to be more radical and to push boundaries in ways that most autistic people, if you survey them, are really interested in orthodoxy, or in like a Nicene orthodoxy, and very set on that. Very much not appreciative of any attempt to depart from those sides. That's not to say all autistic people, like there are autistic people who are super cool with flaunting those boundaries and think this is cool and interesting, but the average autistic person is orthodox, but sort of on the fringes of orthodoxy. So, under the umbrella, but maybe near the edge, where we have lots of weird idiosyncratic views, but they're weird idiosyncratic views that have a place within the Christian tradition. And that is not what you find in a lot of autistic academic theology. It is, yeah, like generally speaking, the easiest way to describe it is it's very progressive coded and has very specific ideas about. There's neurodiversity, the sort of concept, which is that there are a diverse range of human brains and a diverse range of experiences of human brains. And then there's the neurodiversity movement, which is the sort of political arm of asking, what should we do about that? And the answer is like this whole political movement tied to neurodiversity. And a lot of the autistic Christians themselves are not super tied to the political objectives of these movements, but like the idea on its face. It's very complicated.
It sounds like it. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. I find that curious, and I'm hopeful. I know we talked before. We spoke with Sunita Tice a couple weeks ago, and I loved hearing her perspective on how churches and, in a similar way, families can be more accommodating. And I do think many parishes are at that place, yes, where it's like needing to learn how to do it. Or like you mentioned, often it's not until someone on staff maybe has an autistic child or someone who needs accommodation in some way that things begin to change. But often that's maybe very narrowly determined. And so it's a important shift to happen, but it's maybe just beginning in a lot of ways. So
and
I sometimes
like
see little glimpses of that make me hopeful, but it's definitely more on that individual level of what is that parish doing, or that's what you're talking about.
That's sort of what it's like. And like there's a lot of interest in it, and a lot of interest in learning what we can do to accommodate, but oftentimes the reality is autism is a complex heterogeneous condition with many different presentations, and there aren't any silver bullets, right? There's no one size fits all solution to this.
Yeah.
Autistic people, some will have hypersensitivity and some will have hyposensitivity, and often some children will have really strong noise sensitivity, and some autistic children will have really intense echolalia where they're like making a lot of loud noises, and you can't have those two kids next to each other,
Right.
right?
You can't
Because
accommodate both at the same time, at least.
exactly, or you'll have the autism sensory room at church, and it's like, okay, you put both of them in there, and neither are having a good time, because and there are all sorts of like competing sensory needs and things like that. And so it's very much like the whole purpose of this podcast is the biggest issue facing churches right now is none of them even know what autism is, and none of them like understand the complexities that come with it. And so the whole point of this podcast is to try to explain that, right? To try to say, like, this is information. This is good data backed information from like thousands of autistic people. If you want to know what the state of the ground is, this is what it is. So like before you start trying to solve the problem, figure out what the problem is.
What is actually happening?
Yes.
Here.
Yeah. And like,
well, and hearing you describe it, it's interesting thinking about the ways that parenting teaching mirrors what's going on in family systems. Like we'll often talk about how you can learn a lot about a church based on their family life teaching, because the way children are treated in a family is going to be the way individuals in a church family system are going to be treated. Like if there's expectations for instant compliance from parents to children, so too will everybody in the congregation be expected to kind of comply, unquestionable leaders, et cetera, et cetera. But even hearing what you're talking about, like if there's a culture that is able to see individuals and understand like the work of the church being to love and respond to people as individuals in their needs or as families in their needs, there becomes a difference paradigm for ministry, as well as when we talk about like it maybe alters your parenting framework if you remove the instant obedience ingredient and say, oh, what if it's not about just getting compliance? It maybe raises interesting questions about what does it mean to be the gathered people of God? Like, what are we doing on a Sunday morning? And that's interesting to think about.
Like a really big thing that I'm constantly saying is there are no silver bullets. There is no one size fits all solution. This is a complex problem that will have complex solutions. And in order to solve complex problems, you first need to understand what the problem actually is. And like the church has not done that work, basically. And there aren't a whole lot of great resources out there to understand it. And so like that's literally why I made the podcast is to try to be like, okay, I know for a fact I am not the best messenger of this information, but literally no one else is doing it. So I have the data. I'm just going to get in front of a microphone and start explaining to you what the situation actually is, and like the really complicated territory that it comes with. Like are you familiar with Operation Reconquista?
Oh, vaguely.
Like
I don't know if I fully understand it. I've
the
heard
main
people
line.
throwing it around on Twitter and stuff.
Yeah. So that's a movement comprised mostly of young autistic men.
That seems to track.
Yeah. And like, you got a lot of churches that just, we talk about neurodiversity, and it's great. Neurodiversity is great, and it's a wonderful framework. But what about neurodiversity when the guy is coming to your church being like, actually, you guys are on the wrong path and you need to course correct, and is just like an obstinate stick in the mud and unwilling to change. How do you deal with that? Autistic people have a lot of problems understanding social situations, and neurodiversity is great. But what happens when you have a guy who does not understand the way that his behavior is affecting the other women, young women in his church, and how these actions are thought of and perceived, but he doesn't understand because he doesn't have the ability to read subtle nonverbal communication
Mm.
or the hints that they're trying to give him.
Mhm.
How do you deal with those complexities? You never see those in neurodiversity podcasts, unfortunately. But those are the real
Those are
problems,
real. Yeah,
right?
no,
And,
that's
and
a great
this is like
point.
the day-to-day reality that like autism isn't very pretty.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, it's a disability and
Mm.
it's called a disability for a reason. And that's because whether that disability is from something being broken inside of you or from the community's inability to respond to the unique challenges that you have, or the community placing barriers to participation because of their expectation of normalcy. All these things are great questions, but at the end of the
Mhm.
day, it is still a disability, right? It's still going
Yeah.
to have a lot of, there are just a lot of awkward and difficult things that come with it. And I feel like a lot of the church is not prepared to have those conversations right
Mhm.
now, which is what I'm trying to prepare them for.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll see how well that goes. We'll see how
Yeah,
that,
oh,
we'll
I
see
love
how we
it. I
get
think
there.
that's great because you're right. Naming the thing, and this is something we're trying to do with our book as well. Like naming things is kind of the first step in being able, people being able to like digest that information, find a different path forward, make different choices. But that's the first step. So I love that vision for what you're doing.
Yeah, we'll see how well it goes. Yeah. Anyway, think it's good to end it here. Do you have any
Sure.
parting thoughts for my audience?
Oh gosh, what a great conversation. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, you can find me across social media at mburtwright, all the places. And I the bright spot for me on the internet is being able to connect with people. I am a Luddite at heart. I spent many years just completely offline, like no cell phone, no like in the extreme analog life existence, but hopped back on in 2020 and have been pleasantly surprised by the connections with other people in doing this work. So find me, connect with me. I like that. You can find our book wherever books are sold, and we hope it'll be a help to you.
All right. And I'm John. You can find me anywhere on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, at Christianity On. You can find me on Bluesky, Christianity On at bluesky.social. You can also email me, christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. And I think that's it. See you
Great.
later.
Thanks so much.